Christian church and as Christian people that we believe in is something called spiritual gifts, that every one of us, every human being possesses gifts, skills, parts of our personality, ways that God uses us that, in the words of St. Paul in 1 Corinthians 12, are for the common good. It's how we benefit or help other people. And all of us have something. And I suspect that some of you knows what yours are. Maybe you're administrative, so you help organize things, maybe even here at church. Maybe you're a merciful person, so when you see that there is someone who is hurting, you kind of go out of your way and you reach out to that person to show compassion. That's gifts in action. Well, about 4 months ago, I decided I would borrow for our church one of the great ideas of our sister church, the branch church in Alger Heights. And all they simply did, and their pastor, Pastor Chris, recognized was that in their midst, in their congregation, they probably had people who had the gift of teaching. People who, other than him, were very skilled at communicating, at teaching others. And he didn't want to deprive his church of that, so he asked, hey, do we have people here who would like to learn how to teach on Sunday morning? And sure enough, he's got about half a dozen people who teach on a once or twice a year basis. And I thought, well, we're going to do that. And lo and behold, we've got 5 people here who say, yeah, I think I'd like to do that. And I think I could do that well. And I think other people might even benefit from my teaching gifts. It could be for our common good. And this series this summer is going to be the introduction of this teaching team. And the first person is going to go today. This is Brian Kamstra. Brian came to RiverTree because of his now wife sitting over there. Rachel came first, but Brian is now a very beloved part of our church family. And if you know Brian, Brian's a great guy, an easy guy to like. Brian's brings a lot to the table, one of which is his education. When he was at the U of M, nobody hiss, please. When he was at U of M, he, thank you, John. He studied in part the ancient Near East. He studied ancient Near Eastern language, knows a lot about ancient Egypt and ancient Egyptian spirituality. I have borrowed what he knows for messages of mine as recently as last week when we were talking about the Exodus, or started to. So he actually, this is a great message for him to do. He'll tell you kind of where we are in the story of the whole Bible, but it fits really well with what he already knows. So would you welcome Brian? And Brian's going to teach for us this morning. Yeah?
Introduction, PC. So yeah, I'm Brian. I'm kind of an introvert, so some of you may not know me that well personally, but I'm happy to talk to any one of you going forward. So this morning, we're going to be continuing our One Big Story series. A lot of us, whether we're Christians or not, if we look at the Bible, we look at the Old and New Testament, we often think of them as very different. But this series is about how they're actually very similar. We see the ideas, the themes, the stories that we find in the Old Testament, they're continued in the New. They're sometimes expanded upon, but we see the New Testament is deeply rooted in the ideas of the Old Testament. So this is going to be a fairly long series. It's going to be taking the rest of the summer, but we're going through a lot of the big ideas in the Old Testament and tracing how they continue in the New. This week's message is going to be very closely tied to last week's. It might be appropriate even to think of this as like a part 2 mini-series with last week's message. So last week, PC talked about how God frees his people from slavery, from Egypt's power. So that includes political power, spiritual power, moral authority, as well as economic power. Egypt is one of the great powers of its day. But God didn't just take his people out of Egypt. He also freed them for a purpose. He didn't just leave them there, say, you're out, have a nice life. He said, I've got a special mission for you, a special purpose. PC mentioned that last week as well, but we're going to be digging into that in more detail today. So let's jump into the text then. Exodus 19, verses 3 through 6 says, "Then Moses went up to God. The Lord called to him from the mountain and said, 'This is what you are to say, the descendants of Jacob, and what you are to tell the people of Israel. You yourselves have seen what I did to Egypt, and how I carried you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now if you obey me fully and keep my covenant, then out of all nations you will be my treasured possession. Although the whole earth is mine, you will be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words you are to speak to the Israelites.'" Just quick context of this verse. So this is Exodus 19. God has already brought Israel out of Egypt. They've come through the Red Sea. They've headed out into the desert, and now they've come to this mountain where God begins to speak. I want to point out one word that's kind of a churchy word. That word is holy. God says, "You will be a holy nation." Holy quite simply and literally means to be set apart. So it is often used in the Old Testament of God. It means he is categorically different than anything else we know. It also can have a sense that God is far from sin. He is utterly good, and anything deficient or wrong or evil is far from him. And I think that second idea also is kind of applied to Israel, where Israel was meant to be striving to put evil far from it. They were to be special, to be different. And they had a special purpose as well in God's plan. You'll notice in verse 5, there's a "if you obey me fully, then" statement. It's a very logical statement. If you do this, then you get this. Surprisingly, though, the "then" isn't a reward. It's not, if you do this, then I'll give you this nice thing. Instead, God says, if you obey me, you will become something. So there's no reward promised here. God definitely does at times bless people for obeying him. But in this instance, he says to Israel, if you obey me, you'll become something. And we've been kind of dancing around what that becoming is. We'll be getting into what the mission is. There's one other part that may not be clear in this verse. God says, you will be for me a kingdom of priests. This is an interesting thing because, of course, the priests were a small group within Israel. Their job was to administer the temple, to run the worship services, to collect the offerings, and so on. They were to have a special role in helping Israel relate to God on very specific times and moments. Just like today, we come here, even though, of course, we can meet God at any point during the week, we especially set time out each week to gather together. And, for example, PC or the band will lead us, and they have a special role to play in conducting our worship. So that was what the priests are to do. Here, God calls Israel a kingdom of priests. We don't have time to fully unpack that, but what I would suggest to you is God is saying that role that the priests had to Israel, that's the role that Israel had to the other nations around them. They were supposed to have a special relationship with God, but also to, in a sense, lead the nations in worship. God says, the whole earth is mine. So in calling out Israel to be special, he's not saying, I'm abandoning the world, you're going to be the only people I care about. He's saying, you've got a special job to do, but that mission is relevant to the whole world. Even in the Old Testament, Israel is special, but God has the redemption of the whole world in mind. And that's what Israel is supposed to be about. Okay. So, we've said then Israel needs to obey. What do they need to obey? If you're familiar with the text, I already mentioned what's come before Exodus 19. What comes after Exodus 20 is the Ten Commandments. And from there on, the second half of Exodus and Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy are the kind of books we tend not to read so much because they're primarily the law. It's all these different situations that will come up, and God says this is how you're to deal with that situation. We're going to be talking about the law more this summer, and I don't have time to get into all of that, of course, since that's several books of the Bible. So instead, we're just going to pick out one example, and we're going to look at that and see what part of Israel's mission looks like. All right, so Deuteronomy 24 is where we're going to be looking. It says, "Do not deprive the foreigner or the fatherless of justice, or take the cloak of the widow as a pledge. Remember that you were slaves in Egypt, and the Lord your God redeemed you from there. That is why I command you to do this. When you are harvesting in your field and you overlook a sheaf, do not go back to get it. Leave it for the foreigner, the fatherless, and the widow, so the Lord your God may bless you in all the work of your hands. When you beat the olives from your trees, do not go over the branches a second time. Leave what remains for the foreigner, the fatherless, and the widow. When you harvest the grapes in your vineyard, do not go over the vines again. Leave what remains for the foreigner, the fatherless, and the widow. Remember that you were slaves in Egypt. That is why I command you to do this." One of the difficulties I think we have when we open the Old Testament is that it was written originally to people in a time far different from our own. We're separated by it, in many instances, thousands of years and half a world away of cultural assumptions and just the way we live life. So one thing I always like to keep in mind when I'm looking at the Old Testament is anytime God's talking about something, it's something relevant to the people there. So the assumption then is that foreigners are going to be common in Israel. It's an expected thing, as well as fatherless and widows. So that gives us an idea of what Israel's going to look like. There's going to be pain and heartbreak. There's going to be loss. There's going to be orphans and widows there, even in Israel. Even in the midst of God's project of redemption at that time, there's going to be loss. And the foreigners are very interesting. A lot of times when we hear the word holy, sometimes we think of it as, oh, I have to be set apart. I need to be very different from the world around me. And one way we might think to do that is to kind of pull back from those around us that are different. Get very comfortable with people who already hold the same values that we have, who have a similar culture or similar interests or a similar age group perhaps to what we are a part of. So here, the expectation is that foreigners will be very common in Israel. I'm going to do a quick digression. I took the slide out for this because I wasn't sure how I'd be doing on time at this point. But God leads his people to a specific place. I don't remember where off the top of my head. You can see that, but you definitely can, and I can get that for you if you're interested. But he leads Israel to a specific place and puts them there. He doesn't say why. But I would suggest to you, if you go this afternoon, if you want to go Google a map of the ancient Near East and look at where Israel is, you'll see ancient Egypt is to the southwest. There's an area called Mesopotamia to the northeast. And to the northwest, there is what's modern-day Turkey. At the time, in the Bible, it's usually called the Hittites, the land of the Hittites. Pretty much throughout Israel's history, there's an empire in each one of those places. Israel's kind of triangulated by those great powers of its day. And therefore, just like today, those great powers are conducting trade with each other, fighting wars with each other, and so on. So Israel was right on the main trade route for its time. So of course you're going to see foreigners coming through here. There's going to be all kinds of people coming through there because they're on the main highway of that known world. Okay, so how is Israel supposed to help these foreigners? Notice that God does not say, give them what they need, simply. He doesn't say, harvest your fields really well, work hard, so you have extra to give them. Instead, he says, leave something. You take your scythe or cutting implement, you go through the field, maybe you miss a spot. There's a few stalks that don't come down. He doesn't say, go back and get it. He says, leave them there. And then give the foreigner, the fatherless, and the widow the opportunity to go through the field themselves and harvest for themselves. So the principle there is God is saying, give them the opportunity to work for themselves, to help themselves. In addition, you'd imagine then, you're going to have these people come into your field and say, oh, I see you did leave something. Do you mind if I go in and harvest? You're going to have a conversation with them. You're going to have a start to community, perhaps, in that process. So God asks Israel to give opportunities to those who don't have them, to those who are vulnerable. And then he also gives them a reason to do it. Israel's motivation. He says, remember, you were slaves in Egypt. He doesn't say just do it because I tell you to. He gives them a reason. You know what it's like to be a slave, to be a foreigner in a strange land. You know what it's like to be oppressed, to have that vulnerability taken advantage of. And so God says, instead, you guys are going to be different. You're going to relate to people that aren't like you, to people who are vulnerable, to people who don't have opportunity in a completely different way. Okay, so that's Israel. What does that mean for us today? I'm assuming most of us are not Jewish. Pretty sure we're not. We don't live in ancient Israel. What does that mean for us today? So we're going to look at the New Testament now. 1 Peter 2, 9 through 11. It says, but you are a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation. You hear the echoes of those Old Testament verses we read already. God's special possession, that you may declare the praises of him who called you out of darkness into his wonderful light. Once you were not a people, but now you are the people of God. Once you had not received mercy, but now you have received mercy. Dear friends, I urge you, as foreigners and exiles, to abstain from sinful desires which wage war against your soul. So again, I'll give you a little bit of the context before this verse. Peter is writing to the churches in modern-day Turkey. So these are primarily not Jewish people. He's writing to a variety of churches. So this is our people. This is who we are. And it's a variety of people groups. He points it out. He says, once you were not a people. So this is not Israel that he's talking to. Instead, Peter is giving the church, the same mission that God gave Israel. We are also to be holy. We are also to be a royal priesthood, he says. We are to be holy. Again, it means we're to be different. We're going to try to take on new values in our heart, but we're not going to be isolated. We want to be an open community that all can partake in. Okay, so who do we help? Who are the foreigners today? In 1 Peter, he does not mention, he calls the church foreigners, but he doesn't have the same injunction to help foreigners. So there's kind of that question then. How does that mission apply to us today? Who are the foreigners? Let's review what the foreigners were like. They were vulnerable people, a vulnerable group, because they had a lack of community, they had a lack of opportunity, and they lacked economic safety. All of those things were problems for them. I would suggest if we look around today, we would see that foreign people, immigrants, have the same struggles today, but it might not be that specific group that we identify. So I'll just leave you with that. We'll go to the motivation, and it will kind of loop back to who we might identify as the foreigners for us. The motivation is the same that we have, is the same as Israel. Peter here talks to Israel and calls them foreigners and exiles. In other words, we know, each one of us, the pain of loneliness, the vulnerability of having a lack of community. He mentions sinful ways, sinful habits. Perhaps some of us have struggled with long-standing sin in our lives, or addictions, bad habits, or even oppression, injustice in the world. All of those things might be relevant to us. And just like Israel, our heart then is to be for the people who are experiencing the same injustice that we are. So if we're going to ask ourselves, who are the foreigners for us, I would suggest that we start at looking at our own lives. What has God freed us from? And if we look at 1 Peter, again, he says, once you were not a people, but now you are the people of God. Once you had not received mercy, but now you have received mercy. So the idea is that God has given us mercy first. And now we are to take that into our own lives and then become that holy nation for God. So the principle, I think, still stands for us today. We've been freed from a variety of sin, oppression, vulnerable situations, and now we can have a heart for those same things that we see around us. All right. So how do we go about helping then? If we've identified some areas, and I think RiverTree already has identified some groups of people that we especially have a heart for. How do we go about helping them? I would suggest, again, it's the same way as Israel was asked to help. We leave what remains in the field. In other words, we don't go into someone's life and say, I've got the answer. I know what you need to do. I will fix it for you. Instead, we give them the opportunity to do the work themselves. We provide community. We provide some safety for them to grow. All right. So that is a difficult thing, of course. And the way we go about it is we have a heart that understands pain and oppression. In other words, we recognize in our own life that God has worked in our hearts first, that we've been brought out of something, and therefore we don't have it all figured out necessarily. We don't have all the answers yet, but we know we can point to God for people in those kind of situations, as well as providing those opportunities and providing that help. All right, so I'm going to leave you with a quote from Henry Nouwen. He's a Catholic writer from the last century. He's also written a lot about psychology and social justice. So this is he wrote a book called The Wounded Healer, which I've been reading through this week, and I think is a really helpful summary of what we've been talking about. He says, making one's own wounds a source of healing, therefore, does not call for a sharing of superficial personal pains, but for a constant willingness to see one's own pain and suffering as rising from the depth of the human condition which all men share. So once again, I think that illustrates some of what we've been talking about. We're not here to share how we've had little things wrong in our life, but we're meant to go really deep with each other, to look at our own very real pain. And he mentions the universal human condition. We've all experienced loneliness. We've all experienced brokenness in our life. We know what those things are like. So if we go to look at the world around us and see those same kind of things, we already have an idea. We already can have a heart drawing on our own experiences that we recognize that God has brought us out of pain and suffering, and therefore we can help others do the same. So it's absolutely a heart that doesn't necessarily have it all figured out, isn't superior to others, but coming from a place where we can point towards God and where we can experience with others what they're going through. All right, we're going to close with prayer, and the band can come up while we're doing that. Father God, I want to ask that you would open our hearts this morning and this week as we think about those who are weak and vulnerable, who lack safety around us, in our community, in our personal lives. Help us to have a soft heart that we might approach them in a way that's helpful to them, that allows them to be a part of the process of healing themselves. Give us boldness as we do this. May we remember the ways that we've been enslaved and that we were now called to freedom in you. In your Son's name, amen. While we